Hey everybody, we'll get started here in just a couple more minutes.
I can also only chat with organizers and panelists.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today we'll be covering cloud security controls and audit trails. We'll delineate exactly who's responsible for various components of a cloud infrastructure stack, you or the service provider. My name is Joe Kozlowitz. I'm a member of the marketing team here at Greenhouse Data. I'm just going to go ahead and give a quick introduction about the company before handing things off to our feature presenter. Greenhouse Data is a managed IT services and consulting provider that helps organizations succeed with digital transformation, cloud, and application-centric information technology projects. We can help manage, modernize, automate, transform, and future-proof your entire IT stack from on-prem or co-located servers out to fully automated cloud services. We've been a hybrid-focused service provider since day one, offering a mix of services to clients from all over the globe, from offices throughout North America. You can see a few of our larger client names, as well as some recent recognition as a Gartner recommended vendor for managed hybrid cloud, as well as our Microsoft Azure Expert MSP certification, one of only a few dozen awarded. Here you can see how our managed services wrap around a wide array of IT solutions, from multi-cloud management to one-off consulting engagements, migration, DevOps coaching, custom app development, and traditional data center. Our speaker today is Daniel Deter, IT Security Manager at Greenhouse Data. He has over a decade of information security experience and nearly 20 years in IT, including 6 years at IBM leading managed security services, incident response, and compliance with FedRAMP and DISA cloud security objectives for US Federal and Department of Defense clients. I'd like to go ahead and just remind you that you can feel free to ask questions at any time using either the chat feature or the Q&A within the GoToWebinar panel. We'll also have some time for questions at the end of the session. So with that out of the way, I'll hand things over to Dan to get started.
Thank you, Joe. So let me figure out how to share out the screen correctly. Be just a moment, Joe. And team. All right, Joe, do you see my screen?
We can see it.
All right. So let's talk. So again, my name's Dan Deter. I'm the security manager with Greenhouse Data. I've been in this field for well over a decade. I do what I call operational security. So we all work in a field where there are, sometimes it feels like a limitless number of tools. And each of those tools is supposed to solve all of our risk management problems. And yet what we find is that often the tools themselves are so complex and hard to implement that they would benefit from their own 4-year degree. So I do what I like to call operational security. I look at risk, I look at governance requirements, and I try to figure out the best way to implement that from the perspective of the person sitting hands on keyboard doing the work. What we often see in our field is a reliance, an over-reliance on security controls like certifications, or an under-reliance. I first got involved in the process of managing security controls with the FedRAMP program around 2012. When we finally got that FedRAMP accreditation, what we found is that when we were engaging with clients, they didn't really understand what it meant to them. So their initial reaction was to try to reassess us on all of the controls. And it took a couple years to really manage a change in culture to understand what that shared responsibility model looked like. And ultimately, we failed because what we found is a few years later, our clients stopped asking us about controls at all. Rather, they just assumed we covered all their controls, and we started identifying clients that had some pretty significant gaps in their security posture. And so we started really relying on control implementation summaries, but we'll get more into that in just a bit. It was recently asked to me, how do you know if your cloud security provider is doing a good job with your security? And my initial response was, you don't. About a week after that, I was talking to a potential client. They were in a public cloud, they were a HIPAA provider, and we were going through just really high level what HIPAA meant to them as a provider. And I asked them about their annual requirement to do a HIPAA risk assessment. And they're like, oh, our provider does that for us. I'm like, oh, what's that look like? They're like, well, it's their SOC report. And it struck me that this HIPAA provider didn't understand what controls they were responsible for. And it's because they were looking at certifications as a go-to, as an answer for everything. So I decided to do this talk to kind of help people identify how controls worked. Now, let me change my display because apparently I'm just showing you the wrong one. Might be just a moment while I find the right screen. And there it is. How's that, Joe? Okay, cool. Cool. So when we talk certifications, governance, frameworks, generally I probably don't need to explain to anybody on the call what a governance framework is or certifications are, but just at a really high level, certifications are typically an independent review of your adherence to a specific framework, be it SOC, ISO, NIST. But it's not always an independent review. Often these reviews are just done internally. And the governance frameworks themselves are really just a series of controls with varying degrees of complexity. The most complex ones, that is the ones that provide us with the deepest view of security of an information system, are of course NIST and ISO. I would assert that NIST is actually better because it's free. And there's a lot of information for free about it. But in order to really understand what controls you're responsible for, we need to do some governance work. We have to do a crosswalk of those controls. So before we get into how we're going to do that, I'd like to just do a few terms that are really relevant to what we're doing here today. So every control typically has a control origin, and that's often going to be your provider, like your cloud provider. For example, if you're in a major public cloud, that cloud provider is the control origin for all the physical controls. And there's also an implementation status, which is we have or have not done this yet. We have or have not tested this yet. And in each of these different models, the standard cloud implementation models, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service, the series of controls provided by your provider versus the ones you're responsible for changes. And generally speaking, the controls your provider owns, you're not going to have much visibility into. You're not going to have a lot of visibility into how well they're implementing that control or even how they're implementing it. And of course, everything that you're responsible for, you have to manage yourself. So what I'd like to do today is just do a couple quick demos that show you guys an easy way to do your own crosswalks of security controls so that you can really easily look at all the controls, determine what you're responsible for, and then either document how you align with those controls or don't. But also it gives you a great tool for having conversations with your leadership teams, with your operational teams about what you guys should really be doing. So let me bring up AWS real quick. And get logged in. And share out the correct screen. All right, there you go. So right now you're going to see AWS QuickStart page. One of the biggest challenges we face in a control implementation summary and doing crosswalks and identifying controls is that there's typically a lot of controls. And if you look at a framework, ISO, SOC, NIST 853, they are hundreds of pages of individual controls. And that's not really immediately consumable to most people. Rather, you need to put it in a consumable format. And fortunately, we didn't have this 5-6 years ago, but today, the cloud providers really give us templates that we can use. And we can use these not just for this cloud provider. We can use them anywhere in our governance work. So let's see. Let's start by filtering this. Identity, whoops. All right, because I really just want to look at the ones specific to InfoSec. And let's pick one that should be relevant to the most number of people, HIPAA. All right, there we go. So to get here yourself, I've got a link within the presentation, which we'll make available to everyone. But also it's pretty easy if you just go to the aws.amazon.com and look for their QuickStart templates. This is really cool because if you're in AWS, the QuickStart templates not only give you the control implementation summary that we're going to review, hey, Joe, can you hear me? My headset just turned off.
Yeah, you're all good.
Okay. Well, that was weird. It just randomly turned off on me. So they not only give you what we're going to review today, the crosswalk, but they also give you additional tools for building out an infrastructure. The Quick Start includes, for example, the infrastructure as code for a base environment that would meet HIPAA requirements. I suspect in the coming months, we'll probably do some webinars on how to do that as well, and that should be pretty cool. Look forward to it. But let's do HIPAA here. So when you go to the HIPAA site, there's a deployment guide, which we don't really need to worry about today, but basically what that does is it tells you what the architecture is going to look like, it gives you details, and it will even give you, of course, infrastructure as code information. But we are going to do security controls matrix, which I just downloaded. And I'm going to share it with you guys in just a moment. All right, there we go. So this is the meat and potatoes of what we're going to talk about today for AWS. So this is a security controls matrix. Also, if you're in federal, it's probably called a control implementation summary. And as much as I love calling something a CIS, that's also the Center for Internet Security, so I'm trying not to say it. Now, what this does is it's a spreadsheet that takes each section of HIPAA, provides you with a name, it gives you the exact text of the regulation, and it tells you what AWS does in support of it. Now, I'll note, this document contains 173 controls, and 87 of those AWS doesn't control at all, you own. But this spreadsheet becomes a great tool to use if you have to do HIPAA compliance. And again, this doesn't have to be specific to AWS. This spreadsheet just gives you all the controls so you can map out your own. So for example, sorry, I'm all over the place here. AWS doesn't control this. Actually, of course, AWS doesn't control anything related to the personnel or your training. They give you some great resources, but then you can just download this and save it and use it by yourself. So there's a couple fields that you're going to want to add. For example, implementation owner and implementation status. Now this becomes your own document that you can use to determine who in your organization owns controls. For example, this can be something really high level, like my business owns this. Or it can be something far more complex, like network team or HR. This makes it really easy when you're filtering on controls, both in terms of when you initially try to implement them, but also if you're going to be assessing yourself. You can now filter on this and determine which teams own which controls, and that makes it easy for you to open tickets internally or to assign work internally for them to address the control or just a audit artifact of the control. You can do your implementation status. Now these are really simple. Implemented, for example, or planned, or not applicable, risk accepted. Not applicable, relevant data, right? So we just put an implementation status. Again, we can filter on this. So when your auditor, when your executives, when a potential client or your business say, give me a list of the controls you align with versus the ones you don't, all you have to do is open up your spreadsheet, apply a filter, and you've got your data. Simple, effective, efficient. I'd also recommend, and this one becomes a little bit more work, but noting when you last tested the control. This is going to be a date. It's typically going to be at least annually, but it lets you know if you have a control that's being perhaps neglected. We have a lot of controls that we test frequently. For example, if you're doing vulnerability management, you're probably testing those controls monthly, effectively. But your policy documents, you might be looking at them once a year, and that's okay. Policy isn't meant to be changed. I've used this exact document myself for outlining HIPAA controls, but we're going to move on now to another provider. So, as a quick recap, here's a couple links you're going to care about. This is just showing you how to get there and how to download the document. And now we're going to move on to Azure. Azure is really cool. Azure is different, but Azure has taken this a step further in the tool they provide you. Now, once again, going to log into my Azure portal real quick. Might be a moment. I'm gonna have to multi-factor authentication into it. Cool, and all right, here we go. So you should now see my Azure portal.
We got it.
Cool. So Azure provides Compliance Manager. Compliance Manager is a tool within the Azure portal that allows you to do a control implementation summary, but it allows you to do it on a per control basis. They also do something that I think is really cool, and most cloud providers don't do this. They show you their implementation of the control, and they show you when they were last assessed on it. So you see I've got a bunch of assessments here. This has all mostly been me just doing reviews of the individual baselines. If you want to add an assessment, and by the way, this is all free. So if you have an account on AWS, you can download their control crosswalk. If you have an account on Azure, you can access this tool. So let's add an assessment real quick. Demo. They've got the standard governance frameworks we care about. Let's do HIPAA. Again, be consistent. We'll just use, let's use our default group and save it. All right. Here we go. Now we're waiting while it is created. This should only take a handful of seconds. Still waiting. All right, there we go. Now I've done this, I've created these numerous times. That took longer than any time before. And I guess that just makes sense that would happen. Karma. So now we have a assessment that shows us the controls that are already met, 59%. Those are the controls that Azure meets. That also shows you the rest of those controls you have to meet. Customer managed controls, 0 out of 38. And Microsoft managed controls. All right, let's go into it. All right. Hey, Joe, so you're saying you're seeing the wrong window. Well, how about this one? Yeah, okay, cool. Well, let me take a step back then. So this is Microsoft Compliance Manager. It is in preview right now. It's free. I just created to create an assessment. You just click Add Assessment, put in a title, the framework you want to assess yourself against, and you can create groups so you can group different assessments. I just created this controls crosswalk demo. What you'll see, as I spoke to but you couldn't see, as you'll now see, there are 38 customer managed controls, and you'll see it's 0 out of 38 right now. And then there's 31 Microsoft managed controls, and they're all green. And here's the controls. What's really cool about this is rather than having to do a lot of research, you can look at the control, click on it, and Microsoft provides you with the details you need to know about it. You can then click Review, and this is great. This is just like the crosswalk that we did with AWS in spreadsheet format, but now it's a little tool we can use. We are limited to their implementation statuses. These kind of align with NIST, which is great. We can note when we implemented it. Also very relevant to us because we are all in maturing organizations. We can talk about when it was tested and what the results were. We can talk about test plans. And this is great when you have to figure out how you're going to assess a control. You only have to do that once. Then you can document it, save it, and you'll always have it so that the next person who does it, be that you or someone else, they know what the test plan is going to be. And of course, any additional information that may be relevant. Now let me go into another one real quick. Going to go into NIST. I love the NIST framework because it provides us with a lot of information. And let's go into assess. Sorry. Controls info. There we go. So when we go to the controls info, it breaks down the controls based on families or logical groupings. And then it gives us something that is of immense value to us. For example, your actions. Microsoft actually tells you what the control is asking you to do. But of equal importance, it tells you Microsoft's implementation. How they implement it, pretty high level. When it was implemented, and when they last tested it, and what the result was. What I found amazing about this is there were failed controls. And as a provider, you now have the ability to look at your cloud and say, well, which controls did they fail? And I may need to look at a potential compensating control for. And of course, you can export this into Excel as well, so that once you fill out all your data, you can manage it here, you can monitor it here, and then when it's audit time, you can do a quick export, send it to your auditors, send it to your internal teams, easy. So I'd like to thank everybody for their time. That's the end of our demos. Does anyone have any questions? Joe, I can't see the chat, so if there are questions, please let me know.
We got nothing at the moment. We'll hang around for just another minute if anyone wants to ask anything. Thank you all once again for joining us. You can look forward to some more informative security webinars from Mr. Deter in the future.
Again, thank you all very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure. If you do have any questions, you can always reach out to us at security@greenhousedata.com or me personally, ddeter@greenhousedata.com. If you have any other topics you'd like us to cover in future webinars, please let us know. We'd welcome engaging on that.
Thanks, Dan.